Ed, can you hear me? Okay. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Good afternoon. Really happy to be here. I'm Ellah Wakatama, and I'm very pleased to be joined this afternoon by two of our Caine Prize winners, as well as Shani Akilah. So please join me in giving a very second welcome to Lesley, Nneka, Arimah, Makena, Onjerika, and Shani Akilah. The title of this panel is Beauty and Brevity, and we're going to be talking about the power and the magic of the short story, but also the crafting of it. And I'd like to start by giving you a taste from, I love all of your work, but to give you a taste of a short story. We're going to start with Lesley. Lesley, I wonder if you could read for us a little bit and if you could give some context before we get into our conversation. Thank you. I think they were. Yeah. Yeah? No.
Test. Do you want to use this one? Testing. I don't know that I want to give as much context for this particular story as the context would ruin part of the surprise. So I will just go ahead and start reading. Okay. Second chances. Ignore for a moment that 2 years out of grad school, I'm old enough to buy my own bed and shouldn't ask my father to chip in on the mattress so that he shows up with my mother, who looks like she stepped out of a photograph, and she tries to charm the salesman, something she was never good at, but it somehow works this time and he takes off 20%. Ignore for a moment that she is wearing an outfit I haven't seen in 18 years, not since Nigeria, when she was pregnant with my younger sister, though not yet showing, and fell down the concrete steps to our house, ripping the dress from hem to thigh. Ignore that she flits from bed to bed, bouncing on each one like she hasn't sat on a mattress in a while, and the salesman follows her around like he'd like to crawl in with her. Ignore all this because my mother has been dead for 8 years. My father avoids the look I give him, and I'm glad there are beds around because I collapse into one, unable to stand. When I grab my father's wrist, I cannot at this juncture imagine touching her. He twists away from me. I follow him, but he refuses to be cornered, so I walk up to my mother and ask, "What the hell are you doing here?" The salesman looks at me like I kicked her, and my mother looks pained, like I might as well have, but my shock leaves very little room for guilt. "Your daddy and I are buying you a bed. Didn't you say you wanted a bed?" The gentle chiding is something I never thought I'd hear again, and my knees almost buckle, but something about the casual way she's correcting me, like she's got any right, angers me. "Why are you here? You're supposed to be..." My father interrupts this. "Do you want the bed or not?" Both of them stare at me expectantly. I want to press the issue, but I also really, really need the bed. I nod, and the salesman hesitates like he doesn't want to give the discount if it's for me, then walks away to ring it up. My mother is digging through her purse, and I know it's not to pay because she never does when my dad is around, but maybe she's different now. Then she sighs and says, "Ike, darling, have you seen my sunglasses?" The photo my mother has stepped out of was taken in 1982. She is wearing a green Ankara kaftan, belted at the waist, and it billows becomingly. There is a red patina on the photo that has developed over time. As she stands in the kitchen now, humming as she checks the cupboards, I see that the red tint is on her, starker against the white of the cabinets than at the store. The edges of her face are soft, as though she's kept the slight blur of the photo as well. Slung over her shoulder is the tan raffia purse. All that's missing are the red sunglasses. In the picture, they are tucked into the V at her neck, awaiting the Enugu sun. My father putters around her, and he is grayer, paunchier, slower than the last time I saw them together, but they move the same way, a tender, familiar dance. Every time I take a breath to say something, my father glances at me, and his delight shuts me up. When they bend their heads together and begin to whisper, I slip away from the counter and into my father's room. I have to find the photo.
Thank you so much, Lesley.
Oh.
I'm so sorry. If we could have another working microphone, that would be great. Thank you, Lesley. One of the things that I love about your writing is the way that you manage to create a whole world within a short story. And I want to start off our conversation by talking about one of the reviews of your work, especially of your anthology, What It Means When a Man Falls from the Sky, says that you are a skillful storyteller who can render entire relationships with just a few lines of dialogue. And for me, that kind of encapsulates what a short story has to do. But I want to start by asking all of you, why short stories? Because they are hard to sell. I'm sure you all know this from working with publishers. And also, you don't give yourself very much room to explore. So why have you chosen that as your form? What does it allow you to do? Let's start with you, Lesley, and then we'll move on.
Okay. Part of the rendering the impression of breadth in a very small, very confined space. Part of it is laziness on my part because I just like to get things out of the way before, so the story can move on. And I also enjoy the challenge of compression. I find it a very satisfying intellectual challenge to render a relationship in the span of a few words, or to, build a world within a span of a finite amount of pages where I do not have the space to do the level of exploring that I would say in a novel. And I find it very satisfying to essentially pile on all these, scenarios into a story and say, okay, can I pull this off in a way that reads naturally? That does not read, doesn't read as though I, clunkily or clumsily as I'm trying to convey what the parameters of the world are for the reader. And I find that, when I am able to pull it off, I find that incredibly satisfying. And so that's why short stories for me. I also think that short stories allow writers to do things that and experiment with text in a way that people might not necessarily put up for the span of a novel. So you see a lot of really experimental short story forms, like a short story in the form of a Kickstarter fundraiser, or a short story in the form of a letter to the editor. There's things that you can just do with a short story that you cannot do with a novel and have anyone actually read the novel. And so I find that also very stimulating in that sense.
Makena. No.
Nope. Not working. Is it? It's on.
Just go ahead.
So how did I end up writing short stories? I think by accident. I actually started as a writer by writing a novel, or 2 novels actually. And then I ended up in grad school for writing, and I started writing short stories. So I'm not quite sure that it was like a conscious decision that I made to start writing short stories. But what I like about them is in sort of the challenge of saying that I'm going to try and, as Lesley said, there's quite a lot of compression that goes into it. So if it's a sentence, it's about choosing what's the word or verb that I'm going to use that is going to maybe do 2 or 3 things at the same time. And then, and that's enjoyable, just seeing myself doing something that I didn't think I could do. I do find that, because I do teach fiction, I find that maybe a lot of people come to the short story thinking, this will be my practice run before I write a novel. And I usually have to tell them, actually, I don't think that writing short stories is going to teach you how to write a novel. They're two very disparate skills. Yes, you do use the same kind of foundational elements. You know, you have point of view, you have characterization that you're doing, but the story requires a very keen technique. So, for example, you know, I talk to my students a lot about how if you're going to do backstory in a short story, often you are required to have earned the right to do that, right? So you have to, a lot of stories you read will start with something that brings us to an edge where we're now curious. We want to know what happens next. And then, what just happened? And then that's when you can, once you've brought us to a place of suspense, that's when you can now have the right to pause and say, okay, let me tell you all the backstory here. There's all this very, very careful technique that you have to put into a short story. And you do have to do that kind of thing within a novel, but you just have more space to do that in the novel. So what I'm experimenting with right now is actually really weird. Give me a moment. It's weird hearing. Yeah, it's still there, but it's fine. It's distracting. So what I'm experimenting with right now actually is writing a novel in short stories, because when I started writing short stories, I somehow lost the ability to write novels. So I'm actually have struggled for years and years to write the novel. And you would think, oh, you know, now you have more space, you can play. But, you know, the short story kind of allows me to be like, okay, I'll start here and the end is like over there and I can see how far I have to go. But the novel now feels like the end is way over there and I can't see it. And being able to get through to that point is just so much more difficult. So I've taken a different approach to how I'm building my novel, and I really wonder whether it works. I'm curious for you, Shani, because I did hear you mention that you're now working on a novel, having produced a short story collection. What's that like?
Oh, the echo. Yeah. Can you guys hear me? No, this mic is not working. Thank you. So this is... Yeah, okay, this is cool. So it's so interesting. So I started writing short stories because of Bernardine Evaristo, who many of you will know. She was the first Black woman to win the Booker Prize in 2019. And just before she won the Booker Prize, I heard her speak at my local library in South London, which is where I'm from. And I was just really, really inspired by her journey, inspired by the way she spoke about craft. And because of my master's degree and just working, I hadn't written creative writing in a really long time. And we spoke afterwards, and she mentioned that she was doing a masterclass for under 25s in my local area. So I think I just made the cut. I was 25 in like 9 months or something like that. So I went along, and I remember in that first session with Bernardine, I got this really strong feeling like this is what I'm supposed to do. So Bernardine has been absolutely crucial in my journey, and one of the things she told me, which counteracts what you said, was that short stories prepare you well to write a novel, and that's why I started writing short stories. So I did a short stories course at City Lit in London, and my first collection was inspired by an experience in lockdown. So a number of my friends and I were on a dating app called Hinge, which some of you may be familiar with. And as a result of that, I wanted to explore how Black millennials were navigating love and relationships, dating during the pandemic. And so I had this vision for an interconnected short story collection that explored Black love, friendship, and community. But I think it was because of that advice from Bernardine that, you know, short stories prepare you well to write a novel, which is kind of why I started writing short stories. And I think for me, I love the compression, as you both have said. I think I'm really struggling with my novel right now because it is so different. The word count is a lot longer, and I think one of the things I love about short stories is you can kind of get away with a lot of things. You can kind of like not mention things and just kind of leave it up to the reader's imagination. And I think with all of my short stories, I didn't plan any one of them. They just kind of came to me, whereas with a novel, you can't really do that in the same way. But I think what I do love about short stories is the impacts, the momentum, the emotion, the kind of reflections on the human condition. And I'm trying to bring all of those skills now skills and observations to my novel. And yeah, it's really stretching me, but I think I will always be a short story writer. Even writing my novel and kind of interviewing people, it's given me an idea to write a short story collection. So if I could write short stories for the rest of my life, I would do, and I do want to continue to do that, but I also like the challenge of having a novel to write as well.
I think for a reader, there's this pleasure in being introduced to a new writer through a short story collection and seeing all of their different styles and so on. I'm really curious because, Lesley, you started off saying, it's because I'm lazy. And Makena, you were saying, I think, or Shani, that you can get away with things. It seems to me, though, that the crafting of the short story is incredibly demanding. You have maybe 15 pages or less to immerse me in a world, in a life, and everything else. What do you find the most difficult in that process? Are the characters the hardest thing, or is it the setting out of the plot, where it's going to have to be, as you all say, compressed? What's the biggest challenge you face when you're sitting there in front of that blank piece of paper or the empty screen that will become your short story? Who'd like to answer first? Makena.
I'll go first. So for me, the biggest challenge is the first draft. It takes me 5 years to write, like, the first draft. And I know that, the advice is write the first draft quickly, just get through it and power through. And I do have some people that I've worked with who are like, I sit at afternoon and I have this idea and I just put it on paper. For me, the process is usually I have this scene that comes to me very strongly and I know exactly how to put it on paper. So I put it down and then I stop because there's nothing else after. And it takes a couple of years for me to find where it will sit and what it will sit with. And, because I'm taking so long, sometimes it feels discouraging. It feels like, we'll get to this someday, sometime. I'm curious about the two of you. What is that process like?
Speaking of, short stories as practice. So interestingly enough, when I started writing short stories, I thought of them as practice for the novel, but then I quickly fell in love with them as like their own form, and now it's my preferred form to write in. I think the most challenging part of writing a short story is when is what I think of as like recognizing the difference between a short story and like a cool idea, because just because an idea is interesting doesn't mean that it's enough to support an entire like narrative. And particularly, and like I like to sort of and so and I realized that this is just an idea, and there's not enough for a story here. When I start writing it, and then I just quickly like run out of steam. And at that point, I realized that I don't have enough going on here. I need to add whether it's another layering different scenarios and pairing different scenarios with each other, or building up a particular relationship or multiple relationships in a short story. And so I think that's the most challenging part, the distinction between like a cool idea and an actual story.
In the extract that you read, I think it struck me that immediately we know that something is not quite right because of the tense you use and the point of view. And then when we know that the mother is dead, then we're shook. And it's a short story, so we don't have much to explore, but we are deeply within that world and believe it.
Yeah.
How long does it take you to get to that point where you can introduce a whole world in that way?
It really depends on the story. There are stories that come to me very quickly, and then there's story, and this was one of them where I was I started off exactly like. I started writing the story with that scene, and it just sort of kept going. And then there are stories that will take a couple of years, where I will have the idea, right? Like the idea is the only thing that exists, and then it will take a couple of years for me to essentially build the ecosystem around the idea. And I think of it as like the brewing process. Like it's just sort of brewing there back in the stove, and then eventually it comes to a boil. And then I just start writing out the entire story, like the first draft all at once. But this can that brewing process can take, up to 5 years, right? And then there are stories that I write where I just sort of tease them out excruciatingly and very slowly over, and just keep picking at it, and just keep moving forward, and just sort of seeing, getting to a satisfying end. And with a story like that is where it's so I have a lot of ideas, and so I mean, if I think of a particular story, it would be the title story of my collection. What it means when what it means when a male pan falls from the sky, which had several different premises, layered, and essentially, it was challenging to essentially work through. Okay, how can I convey all of these different premises in a way that reads naturally, and in a way that does not, like there's still a story happening. These premises are just that, they're premises, they're background. So how can I convey the reality of that while also unfolding the story?
Yes, Shani, I want to turn to you now, both to ask you the question about what do you find most challenging, but also reading your work, what I felt as a fellow Londoner and as a former South Londoner, it felt very intimate. Like when you describe somebody on a train or friends at a wedding, I felt as if I knew who these people were. And it made me think about your powers of observation. But then distilling all of that into that format, tell us a little bit about the challenges of seeing and then translating. But then also, I'm interested in the linking of the stories thematically, if you could talk about that too.
So I think I would describe myself, well, at the moment anyway, as a contemporary fiction writer. I'm very much inspired by the world around me. My very first story, as Ella mentioned, it's called The Commute, and it basically is just before the pandemic, and it's a character who's on the train, and she sees a character who's reading her favorite. So she sees a man who's reading her favorite book. Readers of the book will hopefully recognize it from the way I describe it. But yeah, I've got stories that are set on, the train in London. I've got stories that are set in the supermarket, Tesco in the UK. I've got stories that are set in a kind of wedding context, and I think a lot of that comes from my everyday life. The story Good Goodbye is about a character who was a bridesmaid 6 times within one summer, and that was inspired by my life of being what I call a serial bridesmaid. And I thought of a scenario of like, what if I saw my ex-boyfriend at a wedding? And from that came a story. So I think the world comes to me first, and then the story comes. I think one of the stories that I really struggled with is a story called Ghana in December. So I studied international development and politics for my undergrad at Leeds, and then I did African studies at Oxford. And as part of that, I spent half a year in Ghana, which I loved. I absolutely love Ghana, and I went back as part of my master's research. And so Ghana has a really special place in my heart, and so I wanted to write a story set in Ghana, but also a story that kind of highlighted this really important part of Black British culture, I would say, of second generation Africans and Caribbeans going to their homelands at Christmas, often Nigeria, often Ghana. And
Dirty December.
Dirty December. And I really wanted to bring that to the fictional space because it's such an important part of not just my life, but my friends' lives. And it's a world that I wanted to portray in fiction. And so I had the world of, doing up enjoyment in December. I wanted to write a story about black male friendship and vulnerability, but it took me about 3 years for the story to come to me and to get it right. And that was inspired by, a family member struggling with mental health. And so that kind of came to the story and made the story more 3D. There are some stories that I have, written in just a few days. I've got a story called Ready, which I wrote in 2 days, sat on my granddad's veranda in Jamaica. The story For Such a Time as This, I wrote as an act of therapy after going through a really difficult time in the workplace at the height of the pandemic, at the height of Black Lives Matter and the murder of George Floyd. And I wrote that after reading Open Water by an incredible author called Caleb Azuma-Nelson, British Ghanaian author, who has written his first novel in the second person and had never read a book ever that was written in the second person. And so kind of going back to what Lesley was saying about short stories being a space to experiment, I've got short stories in my collection written in the first person, the second person, and the third person. And I think through that experience, I really enjoy the second person, and not everyone likes it, but I feel most at home in the second person. I think often the world comes to me first. I'm very inspired by the world around me, and that's why I love to travel. I was in Kenya for my birthday, visiting my friend in February, and I had another idea for a story. So I do definitely find I write my best work in the sun. So I say, if anyone wants to sponsor me to live on the continent, in the Caribbean, for 6 months of the year, I'm taking all donations, because London is not Kenya.
We all do our best work in the sun. Makena, your Caine Prize story, Fanta Blackcurrants, one of the things that the judges praised, I think it was Dinah Mengistu who was the chair of the judges that year, one of the things they praised was the way that you use language and also the intensity of connection with the characters that you portrayed. And thinking back on that story now, I want to ask you, do you feel you've changed as a short story writer? I have to say, I'm quite shocked to hear all of you say 3 years and 5 years. And even though I've been chair of this prize for a while, I realize I have not respected you enough. So I apologize for that. I will do better. But how have you changed as a short story writer after that story? And do you feel that those elements still remain really important to you?
So I'm definitely not breaking language anymore. Not in the way that I did with Fanta Blackcurrant. So I've moved away from that, and everyone who's waiting to find out what happened to Mary, I'm sorry, I don't know either. So yeah, that's that. So I have been, the thing that has stayed is that I keep writing about Nairobi. I think when Yvonne was on stage, she said that she would probably never write the immigrants finding themselves somewhere out there. And I have to say that I lived in the US and a bit of France and a bit of the UK for about 7 years of my life, but I cannot even imagine writing a story in that space. It just feels so foreign, so far away. So Nairobi becomes then the place that I will always, I think, write most about. So that continues to appear in my work. I'm being much more experimental now with, let's say, the form or the shape that the story will take. So some of the stories in the novel in short stories that I'm writing are in the second person. I love the second person. I don't understand people who don't love the second person. It's like, what's up with you? But yeah, so that is very important for me. I'm also experimenting with, so there's I would call it the house story. So when I was a child, I read a lot of stories around how the chameleon got its many colors, or that kind of story is very interesting to me. So just, I think a couple of years ago, someone said there's a particular way in which Kenyans tell stories, and I've been curious to try and puzzle out what that looks like and what that would look like in like a formal short story, in a written form, as opposed to this spoken form. So that's the kind of experimentation that I have leaned on. I think anyone who's expecting Fanta Blackcurrant will probably be disappointed, but I hope that you will like the kind of other things I have done with my work.
This is really fascinating to me. Last night when I was thinking about this panel, I was thinking, is it valid to say that the short story particularly suits an African sensibility? And then I decided that's rubbish. But then I was thinking about visiting my grandmother during the school holidays and being around a fire, and the story starts. And in Shona, you start a story by saying Paivapo, once there was, and then there's a call and response. And then I thought those are all, like, they're oral short stories because it's a limited time and so on. I just wonder, Shani and Lesley, what do you bring from your own lives and I guess the different cultures that you've experienced that you feel makes your short stories award-winning? Because there is something special about all three of you in the success that your short stories have had. Is there something of that, or was I right to think, no, I'm overreaching? Lesley?
Gosh, I mean, when you say, oh, why you're an award-winning writer, that's a question that I find a little uncomfortable. But I'm also very happy that you're finally giving us the respect that we're due. I would say that I bring a certain level of genius. No, but I feel like I bring, I think I bring a very particular sensibility, and that, so I write in English, and I also speak with English. Like my Igbo, I can hear it, but I can't speak Igbo. And so, I say hear it. I can hear some of it. I can't speak it fluently. And so English is the language that I write in. But what I find very interesting is that, and this is something that I just from growing up in Nigeria, hearing of Nigerians, Nigerians have a very particular way of using language, and Nigerians have a very particular way, it's a sentiment that I think of as a very Nigerian sentiment, and then we can even parse it down to a very Igbo sentiment or a very middle class Igbo sentiment. You can even parse it down further, and it's interesting because. Even though I am, so I moved to the States when I was a teenager, and so a significant amount of my life has been spent abroad. But when I meet other Nigerians in writing spaces, or when I meet readers, we all because I think I was old enough when I moved away that I did not think of. That Nigeria didn't become a foreign place to me, and it did not become a place that I felt any need to exoticize and also conversely did not feel any need to sort of valorize the West. And so, so to speak into what Yvonne said, even as somebody who has spent a significant the majority of my life living outside of Nigeria, I think that I also feel a lot of frustration with a very particular immigrant narrative that assumes that what was left behind was always something that was almost a pejorative, and then you've moved on to the West in which you can and that was not something I think I did not do well at all when I moved to the United States, and so that was not something that was ever a reality for me. And so I think that, and so one part of that, I think, is that when I write, my perspective is, I don't write to educate, I don't write to explain. I feel a very, both on the craft level and on a personal level, allegiance to the story and the characters that I'm writing about. And so when I enter the story, it's about like how this particular character sees the world, and if the character is Nigerian, then I'm not going to assume a non-Nigerian audience that I have to explain things for. And it's really interesting because
I want you to say that again, please, because it's really important to me.
Yes, I don't assume a non-Nigerian audience that I have to explain things for. And this sort of came to a head when my collection was out on submission, because we had a couple of interested parties, and there was an editor that was at that point my dream publisher. But the first thing he said was that, oh, these stories are great, but we need to open them up for a wider audience. And I was like, oh, I can't work with you. And what I realized was that, I feel like he liked the stories quite a bit, but he did not understand why they worked. And I was like, the reason why they work is that they're not concerned with an external, unknowing audience. Like there's no assumption of an outsider reading, and that's something that is like, again, like both from a personal level and on a craft level. Like on a craft level, like if I'm entering into this character to write, like that's where I am. I'm not thinking about anything else. Yeah.
That is so important, and I love that you said that, yes. Writers in the audience, take heed that sometimes you have to protect your work by saying no. Shani, so far you've told us that you were in Jamaica, in Ghana, you live in London, you want to live in Kenya. Talk to us about the storytelling from the places that you've been or lived in, or where your family comes from, that inspire your short stories. What are those traditions?
So I'm third generation Caribbean living in London. So my grandparents were part of what's called the Windrush generation. So they came in the 50s and 60s from my dad's side, Guyana, and my mum's side, Jamaica and Barbados. And so I feel that because of that migration, it's so interesting because that generation, they only planned to stay for about 5 years, work and save. 70 years later or whatever, they're still there. So my granddad and my grandmother, they met, and it's a familiar story amongst a number of Caribbeans living in the UK. There's a kind of pan-Caribbean identity. And so I definitely do bring that to my work. But also, I would say that I'm part of very much of a Black British culture. So I am Caribbean, but a lot of my friends are, they're West African, they're East African. So there's very much this kind of pan-Caribbean, pan-African, Black British culture that I bring to my work.
It's the galactic African that everyone.
I really liked that phrase. That was wonderful. So I think the collection is very much an extension of me, not just in terms of my culture, but also, for example, in terms of place. So a number of the stories are rooted in where I'm from, in South London, which is Woolwich. I remember one of my friends pointed out to me that I mentioned Woolwich on the very first page of my collection, and I hadn't realised I'd done that. And so I think just being a writer in the Black British kind of contemporary space, when South London is mentioned, it's often Peckham, it's Brixton, it's Deptford, but I'd never seen a book that had mentioned the other side of South East London, and so I really wanted to bring that to the page. But also faith as well. So I am a Christian. I don't describe myself as a Christian fiction writer, but I'm a fiction writer who happens to be Christian in the same way that I happen to be Caribbean, in the same way I happen to be from Woolwich, and so I bring that to the page in a very normalised way. I think often when I've read books that kind of do mention faith, Christian characters are portrayed as just very weird or frumpy and just not cool, and that hasn't been my experience growing up, and so I kind of wanted to show multiple narratives around that, but also characters that grapple with faith, grapple with the church, and kind of bringing that to the story as well. And I think I'm really interested in the Black church in the UK and how that has been such a site of community and ownership in terms of owning their own churches, but also the rise of musicians and artists learning their craft in church and being such part of global music scene. And so for future books, that is definitely something I do want to explore in more depth.
That's wonderful. I'd love to give the audience, or don't give us context.
the context I would give is a spoiler, and you'll find out from the first line, but a few years ago, I spent some time in Jamaica, and I wrote this story very quickly on my granddad's veranda. I find that whenever I go to Jamaica, I'm very inspired. I remember when I was 15, again, I was stuck with, had to do a piece of creative writing, and I didn't have an idea of what I could do, and then I went to Jamaica, had an interaction, and I wrote a story. So Jamaica has a very special place in my heart. This story is called Reggie. Before Grandad told me he was dying, I knew. A younger, more zealous me would have said it was a prompting from the Holy Spirit. On the phone, amongst his usual eschatological talk on the evening restrictions were lifted, he said, "I'm not too wonderful, Sean. My belly not good at all and my back stiff up." There was an immediacy to his typical refrain of going home to be of the Lord, something he had been saying for at least the near 3 decades I had been alive. And then he revealed the sickness in his lungs that had spread to his liver and kidneys. He said the doctor didn't know how long he had left. I held back the tears I could feel in my throat, though some escaped. I took a seat on my bed to steady myself. He said he would call my mother. I was relieved. I wasn't ready to speak to her, not yet. Before hanging up, for the first time, I told him I loved him. Rubbing away the tears that had smudged my foundation, I opened my laptop. I had already booked off a week's annual leave with plans to find a last-minute, all-inclusive package, somewhere remote with sun and sea where I could forget for a few days the bad decisions I had made over the past few months. Instead, I felt an urgency to change my plans. I looked into the mirror at the Adinkra symbol tattooed to my left arm and the black and blonde sister locks that flowed beyond my shoulders. These were the supposed markers of rebellion in my adult life that had previously stopped me visiting Grandad, preempting his old-school Pentecostal disapproval. But they now paled into insignificance. I needed to see him for the last time. A week later, Raymond, who has been Grandad's driver ever since he retired and moved back to Jamaica over 25 years ago, meets me at the airport. He says, "What a way you put on weight, Miss Shana." And I force a smile. I remember that Caribbean elders have no filter. The air is hot, hotter than I remember, but I'm disappointed not to see the sun. It is overcast and looks like it may rain. Outside the airport, the roads are full of cars, trucks, and men and women alike who walk on the side road with a gentle sway in their hip, lacking any sense of urgency. It is this slow walk in contrast to my hurried step that always gives it away that they are from here and I am not. I am reminded of the words of Gioma, "So here you are, too foreign for home, too foreign for here, never enough for both." Diaspora blues. Sat in traffic, I see a red and white billboard that reads, "Get enough data, talk more," and a message from the Ministry of Transport that says, "Protect your head, don't end up dead." A man in a black, green, and yellow One Love Jamaica t-shirts walks between the vehicles shouting, "Water, water," "Banana, banana," with bottles of water labelled water in hand and bunches of bananas on a plate on his head. "Smile Jamaica" by Chronix echoes from a sound system in a truck with a sticker on its bumper that says, "God's mercies, God alone." The music is loud, but I don't feel rattled. I have the window open. I smell the salty sea air as we pass the ocean. Here, the blue of the sky is merged with the blue of the sea. I want to run to it. I want to have a baptism and be cleansed of my sinful thoughts. The same thoughts that drowned out the claps from passengers that sounded through the aircraft as we touched the runway hours before with headscarves, bonnets, and sports caps in abundance. We passed a church, and then another, and another seconds later. Faith, Temple, Assembly of God, Calvary Baptist Church, New Testament Church of God. We pass a makeshift shack with a weathered corrugated roof. Pineapples covered in plastic hang from the structure like earrings. Its wooden shelves are filled with rows of ripe mangoes, papayas, and guavas. The seller of the fruit is a woman with a baby boy in her lap. He sucks on her left breast. I turn away. Irie FM sounds as we make our way from Montego Bay to Mandeville through the winding roads marked with deep potholes. Raymond's driving gives me motion sickness. I ask him for a sheet from the Jamaica Gleaner sprawled out on the back seat. 1 year on a trip to Negril with my cousins from Canada, the car packed with jerk chicken, cocoa bread, and sorrel in a cooler. Grandad told us that sitting on a newspaper whilst in the car helped ease the discomfort. It always did, and I never thought to ask why. You're a big woman now, Miss Shana. Very pretty, says Raymond, above the steady 4-beat rhythms of the reggae sounds. You have husband yet? I half smile and say no without qualification, trying to change the subject. He is relentless and says, don't wait too long now, Miss Shana. As a woman, the eggs them dry up. I do not reply and stare out the window. I'll stop there.
Miss Shani, that was wonderful. I have to say throughout, I love your sentences. There's a melody to them. But then also what strikes me is that your voice is different in the stories, and yet it's united. And I wanted to ask all of you about that, because in each story that you write, there is a need for a different voice because the characters are different and so on. And yet for a collection to work, there has to be some kind of cohesion. So in your editing process, as you're putting your stories together, and Makena, as you're working on your new connected novel and short stories, what are some of the difficulties that you face, or what are the things that you really love about making these work as one coherent book? Can you talk a little bit about that process?
So my answer will be quite short. I haven't started that process, and it's a bit scary. So I've been writing about 21 stories over 8 years, and I know that they are they're not a single piece, although they exist in the same sort of universe over the same characters. So yeah, we'll find out.
So I always knew for this collection I wanted it to be an interconnected short story of characters that connect in some way. And I think as a reader, I find the most satisfying short stories are the ones where, or just even novels, Homegoing by Ellah Wakatama, like the characters being interconnected, I find it so satisfying, particularly at the end. And so I wanted to write a story in that way. In my book, there's a main character called Nneka, and she has a group of friends from university, from school, from sixth form, and from work, and they all know each other because of her and this games night she throws at her house every year. And so I think I had written the stories, and then later in the editing process came the connections. So I had like this big piece of paper with just like the names and like just various lines scribbled around. I kind of changed names for certain stories, but all the characters come together at the end, and I found it really satisfying kind of getting to that stage. And the first character who we see is a spoiler alert, but the first character in the first story who's reading the book on the train, he appears in the last story after 3 years, and so I think that's a really nice kind of moment for the reader. So I think I was inspired by other authors who've done the same.
That's lovely. Lesley?
My collection is not a connected collection, and so I wrote all of the stories distinctly. In fact, for a while I didn't realize that I was writing a collection. I was just writing short stories, and so I wasn't consciously thinking about this level of connection. I was just writing the short stories, and in fact, for me, I can't think of the other things. Like I'm very much like a minding my own business writer, where when I'm working on a story, that's the only story's business I'm minding, and like this has to work as its own distinct entity. that does not necessarily reference or pull from anything else. And so I'm entirely focused on making this, this container of this story work. When it came time to, once I realized, I might, have enough stories for a collection, when it came time to put things together, I think that, yes, the stories were all very distinct in terms of subject matter, in terms of voice, in terms of character, but they were all written by me. And so there was like a thread, like the meanness of it carried across all the stories that gives it a sense of cohesiveness.
But also, I think thematically, that, there's a sense of your concern with women.
Yes, exactly. Yes,
with,
yeah.
I guess autonomy, all of those things come through. And so I guess that's the meanness you're talking about.
Yeah. I am interested in the stories of women and girls who are making their way on the world, making their way in the world unconventionally, whether it's like unconventional in the emotional sense or unconventional in the career sense, or just people who don't quite fit in. And so you see a lot of those sort of recurring themes in the work. And so, yeah, it created a cohesion.
Wonderful. I would like us to end with Makena reading to us, fittingly so, since we're visiting her home. Makena, if you could give us a short reading. Thank you.
Okay. So I'm reading one of the stories from my novel, and I will just jump into it in view of the time. It's called In the Forest of Talking Animals. It's published, so if you just go Google In the Forest of Talking Animals, you can read the rest of it if you want. Here we go. The girl watches the forest taking over the street and changing buildings, people, and rubbish into trees, bushes, and animals. The world elongates, darkens, and gains shades of green, brown, and burnt orange. The girl is crouching on a heap of quarry stones near her older brother and his best friend Sami, who are trading insults in a game of mchongoano. Unaware that they are changing into trees, the boys rub their hands together, each giving the other maniacal grins, each proud of his scathing cleverness. You are so black. When a stone is thrown at you, it goes back to the thrower to ask for a torch. Only that, you are so ugly. When the devil sees you, he says, Jesus. Their foreheads are wet with the sweat of vigorous gesticulation and luminous in the sun drifting down to the land of the dead. The girl watches their heads grow into majestic crowns on thick back necks, but they cannot see the old woman sitting on her back, sucking out her spirit. Kim, she begs. Her brother is too immersed in his game to hear her. Across the street, Eric from upstairs is counting against the wall of Building 4 and growing branches through his ears, and the other children who live on the street are startled antelopes running in zigzags and trying to find good hiding places. Kim, the girl tries again. The old woman whispers a stale breath against her cheek. You have only me now. The little girl shakes her head to clear her vision and regains pieces of the world. Kim and Sami, half a building, a fishmonger sitting on a stool nearby, dropping whole tilapia into the dark, wide mouth of a pan full of sizzling oil. Then the old woman cackles and spits towards the boys. Suddenly, they are no longer playing. Their faces harden and their bodies bend to war. Kim throws the first punch. They fight like lumps of clay, pounding each other into shape. And the old woman laughs and digs her nails into the girl's shoulder. What are you doing? Shouts the tailor from where she's sitting inside her shop in Ebenezer shopping center, her feet spreading roots into the cracked concrete floor. In her hair, yellow weaver birds go in and out of their nest. The little girl shakes her head again. Nyinyi, shouts the tailor as she throws an empty tin at the boys. They stop and consider each other, surprised at their actions. Then Sami flashes his pink tongue at the siblings and runs off to play hide and seek. Only me, little girl, says the old woman, pushing the girl's head aside to attack her neck again, like a calf coming to its mother's teat for the first time. She's gelatinous in the girl's head, poisoning her with visions of the forest. "Kim," cries the girl, "stop disturbing me. Just go home if you want." The girl's brother kicks a rock, sticks his hand in his pockets, and longingly watches Sami, who is now at the center of a hide-and-seek group across the street. And I'll stop there.
Thank you all so much, and thank you for being a wonderful audience. There isn't time for a question and answer session, but Lesley, Makena, and Shani will all be around so you can talk to them. I do want to mention that Lesley has just been in Zanzibar teaching our latest Caine Prize workshop. So I invite you to watch out for our next anthology, because in Lesley and Otieno Winyo's hands, I've heard from our director that it could be our best collection yet. But so, Lesley, Makena, and Shani, thank you so much, and thank you for letting us into your secrets as writers, and also, challenging some of our views. And thank you all very much too. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, no, you can please give them a warm round of applause. And please buy their work. The books are just fantastic. And if you brought your copy, can you hear me? If you brought your copy, will you do signing? Yes? Okay, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. And if we can literally give you your flowers, both literal and metaphorical. Thank you so much, Ellah. Thank you, Shani. Nice to meet you. Yes.